Students reading the four Gospels will notice almost immediately that the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, look very similar to each other. We call them the synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means viewed together because they're very similar. They have a lot of similar stories, basically a similar structure. John's Gospel is very, very different in a lot of ways. The dialogue is different. Jesus speaks a little bit differently. There tend to be long discourses, interviews with individuals. Jesus' conflict with his enemies become these long kind of debates. And so a very different emphasis. How do we account for that emphasis? We really don't know, of course, why the Holy Spirit gave us three so similar Gospels and one different, certainly written to different communities in different contexts. But we really have to say that John's Gospel is almost certainly written in a different situation. The church is facing new challenges and new issues. We can point to some of those issues, certainly. One of the issues must be related to Jesus' true deity and his true humanity, because no gospel stresses as much the true deity of Jesus Christ as John's Gospel. It begins, "In the beginning was the Word referring to the Son of God, Jesus, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So the Son of God was with God, that is distinct from him as a distinct person, but he was God. He was truly divine. So probably Jesus' claim to deity is being challenged in John's church, or the churches that John is writing to. And so John writes to respond to that. The true incarnation, the fact that Jesus is truly human. Later on in John 1, it says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." So that God became a true human being is another strong emphasis on John's Gospel, something that's evidently being challenged in his day. Jesus as the self-revelation of who God is sort of the central theme. So evidently that was a live issue, an issue of concern, probably an issue of challenge from the outside during the time John's Gospel is written. Another aspect of John's Gospel, the situation or occasion of John's Gospel, is John's Gospel seems to be written somewhat later than the others, and we can tell that especially because it seems that John has been written after a decisive break between the church and the synagogue. We see that because John frequently refers to Jesus' opponents as the Jews. Now, that's an odd statement if you think about it, because Jesus is Jewish, so it's Jews versus Jews, and the disciples are Jewish, so that's Jews versus Jews again. So this is an inter-Jewish debate, and this is an inter-Jewish conflict. But in fact, in John's Gospel, it becomes Jesus and the disciples versus the Jews. That suggests that John is writing at a time when the Christians had become a distinct entity apart from the synagogue, and there was clearly conflict between the two. And so John is writing to encourage his readers to challenge them in the face of increasing hostility between the Christians and the Jews. And that's reflected in John's Gospel, once again pointing to the fact that likely John's Gospel was written in the late 1st century, whereas the Synoptic Gospel is written somewhat earlier in the 1st century.